to Mindcrime Limited Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Keith Preston to discuss, is anarchism reactionary or progressive? Tim, why is that even a question?
I want to bring up why I sort of got to this question here. A few days ago, Keith posted a post on Facebook comparing the MAGA yahoos at the Capitol and the BLM writers over the summer. And he stated that none of them had a clue and were just blowing off steam, sort of engaging in catharsis almost. And I agree entirely. The plan part, or the lack thereof, is something which I agree with entirely. Which is something that MacIntyre, who wrote a book called After Virtue about 40 years ago, and that's one of his primary arguments, is the idea that most Enlightenment era ideologies have failed. The first of which he goes after, of course, is Marxism. He says for all the criticisms that Marxists wield at the current society, they view out of this rotten society a new society will be formed, and they're very much committed to progress. The dictionary definition of progress is a movement toward a goal or to for a further or higher stage. So if you want, so most of the Marxist project, the Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, China, if you want to describe them in narrow terms, they succeeded. For example, Cuba can resist American influence. The Soviet Union won World War II in the East with a giant jihad. The Cuba creates more doctors. There are sort of narrow technical areas where the Marxist states have succeeded or done better than the West, or Western liberal capitalists, whatever you want to call the air quote West states. For many years, the Russian Federation had better space technology, arguably. So there are certain technical areas. And so if you want, by narrow technical grounds, they've done better. But for this sort of beatific vision, to use the sort of Christian parlance, of progress, the sort of city on a shining hill, the Soviet Union did not end up that way. Cuba did not end up that way. None of those products ended up that way. They were sort of, and actually today they're almost somewhat borderline reactionary societies. I'm going to also include liberalism. MacIntyre will be also a critic of liberalism as well. John Gray, writing in the early 2000s, wrote the interesting article titled "End of History," and his idea sort of mirrors Peter Zeeland's, who I found him through you, Keith, is the sort of U.S. global system is dependent on American global power, which is not going to be permanent. And actually, the invasion of Iraq was sort of the zenith of this, which the idea of creating a Jeffersonian Swedish republic in the Middle East failed miserably. So that's another failure. Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe Poland or East Germany, but the other societies are sort of quasi-reactionary societies at this point. So that failed, this sort of expansion of democracy in the East. Again, if you want to argue on narrow technical grounds, yes, they succeeded. And another ideology that failed is feminism. It's worth pointing out, like, for example, my grandparents on my one side worked in a shirt factory. So glorious, but that's also true now. Women work at Walmart and women work as waiters, but that was true beforehand. So feminism as a sort of a big capital I ideology failed to bring about some sort of shining the hill. Civil rights in the U.S. Civil War also failed on broad terms as well. Again, you have a black middle class, but you have a bigger underclass, and actually people like Condoleezza Rice and others have worked as the Barack Obama, they worked as sort of the center of the American empire. So and actually recently we had the war on COVID, and that's another sort of technocratic liberal idea, which has also somewhat failed. The 15 days turned into months. And again, maybe in the terms and conditions, the vaccine was only supposed to do efficacy. But even that, there have been a number of breakthrough cases. And again, maybe in the narrow black and white terms and conditions, they've stated this. And so we see a long litany of failures in the past 80 years. Again, on grand scales. On narrow technical grounds, Cuba creates more doctors, resists American tyranny, but that's not really a big goal. So first of all, Keith, which leaves the only ideology left is anarchism. And you, I'd say, is one of the best defenders of it. It's just someone alive today. Actually, and some people like Chomsky have arguably been co-opted in a way, although not entirely. And of course, you have the right anarchists as well, the more reactionary ones. So do you agree, first of all, with the general account of failures over the past 60 to 90 years of ideologies to bring about some sort of change, Keith? Would you agree with that account? I've listed a variety of them. Keith?
Well, I think it's a complicated question because things like success and failure are relative terms when we're talking about some of these questions. If we look at it in terms of did any of these philosophies achieve all of the great things they were supposed to achieve, no, they never really achieved what their vision, their founders or originators envisioned. I think we have to consider that most modern ideologies are rooted in Enlightenment thinking or derivative of it, or perhaps in some cases are a reaction against it. But out of the Enlightenment came this idea that human beings were perfectible, that you could use reason, education, science, social progress, all of these things to essentially change the human species so that human beings could learn to live without violence or crime or war or oppression or all of these kinds of things. And if you go back and you read a lot of the utopian writers from, say, the Enlightenment era through the 19th century, even into the early 20th century, you find some pretty far out thinking. I mean, like some of the early socialists, for example, the early utopian socialists like Charles Fourier, they had this idea that in the future there would be rivers of lemonade and things like that, or you had science fiction writers that had this kind of utopian paradigm where people would live in domed cities with controlled climates and that kind of stuff. And some of the more far-fetched ideas that came from that time period were never realized. But then more modest things did happen. If you look at the world that we live in today, or at least that people in developed or reasonably developed countries live in today, and compare it with the world of, say, 1850, we do see that we do kind of live in a science fiction world compared to that. If we look at, say, the world of 1850, who in 1850 would have envisioned the internet, being able to do things like this podcast, space travel, airliners, nuclear weapons, or all of these kinds of things that we have today. So, relative to historical experience, modern civilization has created things that are like a science fiction world compared to what had previously been the norm. But then some of the hopes that were associated with those things never really came into being. If you look at, for example, socialism, we don't live in workers' paradises today. If anything, class relations and labor relations are going backward in many parts of the world. If you look at something like civil rights, as people on the progressive end of the spectrum will be the first to tell you, we don't have perfect equality of races or whatever, or genders or any of these categories. And of course, during that time period, during the last, say, century and a half, 2 centuries, there's been an awful lot of negatives. The 2 world wars, the advent of mass warfare, total warfare, nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, a lot of other things as well. So it's been sort of a mixed bag. I don't really think we can say all of these older philosophies entirely failed, but they never achieved what their originators wanted them to achieve.
So, Keith, do you think Steven Pinker is right insofar as the Enlightenment has succeeded? For example, more people have running water and running toilets. Would you also point out other areas, sort of liberal democratic capitalism, welfare state capitalism, which is a mouthful, but I think that's sort of a way to describe it. Do you think it has succeeded there? And you also bring up the sort of the downsides. There's certain phenomena today that wouldn't be possible. The left's favorite genocide of the right could never have happened without railroads and modern technology. And also mass incarceration probably could have never happened without modern wealth and institutions as well. So there's other things that have come along, which sure you get the sort of primitivist tendencies that pop up Would you say someone like Steven Pinker, who wrote a book that's sort of famous for his thousands of tables in there, do you think he is right, so to speak? Keith?
Well, I think that he's right in the sense that, yeah, it's true that in modern societies around the world, the ones that are the most developed, you typically have a higher level of living standards for most people. You have longer life expectancy. You have less infant mortality. You have fewer deaths from childhood diseases or preventable diseases. You have better sanitation systems. You have higher literacy rates, at least on a general level. The average person is probably less or probably more protected from violence than what you would have found in some older societies. At the same time, parallel to that, you find that there's a great deal more regulation of life. The idea, just about anything that you do in a society like the United States today, and I would imagine it's similar in England, you have to have a government permit for it in ways that wouldn't have even been conceived of in older societies. The technology that we have for surveillance now, the idea that we have these cameras everywhere that follow us around, and not only that, but satellites and other methods of surveillance, electronic surveillance, that would have been inconceivable in older societies. Libertarians will point out the tax rates that we typically pay in modern societies, although parallel to that is the fact that aggregate wealth is also higher. Like everything else, I would suppose it's been a mixed bag. Everything has its price, and a lot of the positives that have come about in modern societies and under the rule of modern ideologies have brought a price along with them. All in all, I would say that the Enlightenment was successful in the sense that, most countries around the world are liberal democracies now that have their rooted Enlightenment philosophy. Certainly, the market economy has become dominant. Industrial civilization has become dominant. We see the prevalence and domination of science. Science has eclipsed religion. We see technology helping people overcome problems like better surgical techniques and on healthcare and that kind of stuff. So in that respect, the Enlightenment worked, but not without cost. I mean, any social progress, or if you define it as progress that ever takes place, always has some kind of cost associated with it. In fact, I wrote a book a few years ago called Thinkers Against Modernity, and it's a collection of essays on thinkers that have criticized modern civilization in various ways, usually from some sort of conservative or reactionary perspective. And the reason I'm interested in that is that it's always interesting to go back and look at different sides of historic conflicts and look at what the losers had to say, the people who ended up being on the losing team. Well, did they actually have a point? You can find a lot of people from past times saying, well, look, if you do this, if you change this, if you implement this, this is going to be the consequence. And if you go back and see what they had to say, often they were right. So the question is, was the consequence worth the perceived social or whatever advancement that accompanied the changes that took place?
So, Keith, you seem to be defending the Enlightenment, and actually the modern managerial state is never a sort of product of the Enlightenment, which you've talked about at length before as well, which goes back to my first question. You stated that the capital writers and the BLM yahoos didn't really have a plan because there isn't a plan. If you get the sort of social democrats like Sam Cedar or Ben Burgess, who sort of attacked right-wing libertarians at being yahoos themselves, thinking you can get rid of the regulatory state. So then do you think the sort of protesters there are just letting off steam and sort of are just sort of, you're almost sounding almost quasi like sort of like a sort of standard conservative here. Like, I mean, again, you could say, well, they should be allowed to do it in theory, but in a few days the order will just reemerge, and the Walmart will get its ship back in order, and so will the Capitol. You seem to be almost defending the system in a way. If this is the system that creates the wealth, and how does that relate to sort of broader anarchism? If you're sort of defending all the sort of fruits of the Enlightenment, and you can debate whether the state created the wealth or the free market created the wealth. You have a book like The Entrepreneurial State, but you also have the state also is some of the things the state creates are menaces. Whether or not the virus was created by a research lab is an interesting question. But nuclear weapons were created by state scientists and probably wouldn't have been created privately. So you can sort of get into in-between fights over where exactly this technology emerges, whether it comes from private capitalism or sort of state social democracy or state-planned economies. But if you sort of overthrow this system, it just seems like we're going to be replaced by roughly the same system. So I made that point there. And then more broadly, would you say anarchism is a more reactionary or more progress or furthering the goal, which is already started here? So I made a point, and then it's sort of a question there. Keith?
Well, as to whether I'm defending the legacy of the Enlightenment, I guess it comes down to being a value judgment. It depends on whether you think the advantages are better than the consequences. I think that's largely an individual value judgment. I don't know how that can really be quantified. As far as what the comments that you're describing, where I described the riot at the Capitol and then the BLM riots and all that kind of stuff, what I was saying is that the people participating in that have no kind of plan for what kind of society they actually want to have once they tear down the social structures they're protesting against. In the case of the rioters at the Capitol, they seem to have a wide range of motivations. You had everything from the folks who think that some secret cabal of satanic pedophiles are running the government to those who think the election was being stolen, that Trump was the real winner, and all of those kinds of things. That milieu just seemed to be a hodgepodge of those particular cultural and political sectors. So I don't know that they really had a whole lot of agreement on what they were trying to achieve, other than I guess they wanted Donald Trump to still be president. If they had been successful in driving the government out of D.C., I don't think they would have had any kind of plan as to what to do next. They just would have been sitting around really saying, well, what now? And the same is true with the rioters over George Floyd and all of that. When you look at some of what their demands are, to the degree that they make coherent demands, sometimes they'll talk about actual reforms, like they want to have put more restrictions on when the police can use lethal force, or things like that, all the way over to things like abolishing the police altogether, more extreme views. But I don't know that any of them really have any kind of plan for what society itself would look like if they became politically hegemonic. A lot of it seems just very reactive. They don't. That doesn't really seem to be an end game. Since we're talking about the issue of whether anarchism is reactionary or progressive, I think one issue there is that there's really not just one type of anarchism, and there's not just one approach to anarchist philosophy. You have a branch of anarchists called anarcho-primitivists who want to do away with modern technology, who think of themselves as followers of the Unabomber or characters like that, or John Zerzan. You could argue that that's the most reactionary philosophy there is. Like somebody who believes we should go and live like the people that we see, in the uncontacted tribes around the world, like the folks in the North Sentinel Islands or whatever, or the remote Amazonian tribes. Somebody who thinks that's what the norm ought to be. You could argue that's about as reactionary as it gets. On the other hand, I know a lot of anarcho-primitivists who think of themselves as progressive, which I don't, really know how they reconcile that, but that's how they see it. You certainly have certain types of anarchists, certainly anarchists of the right, who think of themselves as conservative. They think of government as something that is antithetical to tradition or bourgeois values or even more conservative traditional values. And then you've got anarchists that are sort of like, proponents of extreme proponents of the Enlightenment philosophy, where it's everything is almost like a Jacobin type of outlook. So, and I guess whether anarchism is or reactionary progressive would be dependent on which of those paradigms you hold to. So there's a lot of different ideas on that among anarchists. I've heard some theorists of the state, defenders of the state, say, well, anarchism is the most reactionary idea there is, because they want to go back to like things were at the dawn of history before humanity had states. That point of view sees the state as a civilizing force. Now, I don't agree with that, but that's how that particular outlook is articulated. So then this in turn gets into questions like, how do you actually interpret history? Is history progressive? That's another idea that came out of the Enlightenment. In fact, it's one of the aspects of the Enlightenment that I tend to be the most skeptical of, because it seems like, first of all, how you define progress is once again subjective. Also, when you look at things that are touted as progress, alongside all of that was a lot of things you could certainly consider to be regress, like the 20th century. Okay, so women got the vote in the 20th century. Yeah, we also had 2 world wars that were like the biggest wars in history, and genocides and blood purges and all these other kinds of things. Was that progress as well? It's the idea that history is progressive, I think, is something that I tend to be more skeptical of. I tend to think history simply happens, it unfolds. Human beings can improve their own condition over time in certain ways through effort, like inventing better medicine or healthcare technology or whatever. But at the same time, there's always going to be negatives. Sometimes the negatives may be compounded by other things that are considered progressive in other ways. Like modern technology has given us better healthcare. It's also given us nuclear weapons. So, it's sort of a paradox.
Keith, if the United States was to break into thousands of different sort of anarchist communities, similar to your vision of pan-anarchism, if you were to guess, and it would obviously be a guess, how many of these anarchist societies do you think would be broadly progressive or liberal, and how many of them in the current United States would be more conservative or reactionary? The reason I ask for one thing is a lot of the left will criticize you for being an apologist for fascism, because you can allow the fascist community to operate. Now, obviously, there'd have to be a huge ideological change for this to happen. But supposing that everybody just ceased being a statist of some description, but kept the rest of their ideology intact, how do you think the United States would look?
Well, fortunately, we actually have test markets for that. I think the big qualification is the one you mentioned. If there's no other change other than just the state evaporates, and there's no other change in cultural norms or intellectual paradigms or anything like that, or technological developments, those are all important qualifications. But if you look at a map of American electoral results, what you typically see is that the blue sections, the left-leaning sections, tend to be smaller in number, but they tend to be areas that are more heavily populated. And whereas if you see the red zones that tend to be more conservative, they tend to be larger in size but more sparsely populated. And if you remove, I've seen maps like this where they actually remove where they actually control for population in terms of the coloring and all of that kind of stuff. And when you control for population distribution, what you see is that red and blue zones are fairly even, and you have a lot of I won't say white zones because that raises other implications. But I'll say gray zones. You'll have a lot of gray zones where there's really not any people. So the U.S. population is split about down the middle between blue leaning and red leaning. And I think that that's kind of what it would look like, again, with that important qualification that you made that there's no other changes. I think if, say, every county in the United States became sort of the equivalent of a micronation or a city state like Monaco or something like that, about half of them in terms of population distribution would be blue, and the other half would be red, or perhaps there would be a greater number of reds, but the blue zones would be the most heavily populated. And then I think you would also see breakdowns into micro tribes beyond these two big tribes. I think that in the red zones you also have the black belt, which is African American. In the large cities, those tend to break down into different ethnic enclaves. And in fact, there was a map of California I saw recently that had been designed where it was broken down on the basis of ethnic population. And what you see is that while California is probably the most diverse of any of the states in terms of population, you also see people grouping off into all these different ethnic enclaves. For example, if you look at a map of the Los Angeles area, you'll see there's a Cambodian enclave and a Iranian enclave and a Iraqi enclave or whatever. So I think you'd see all these different kinds of ethnic and cultural and religious and political enclaves developing. And then you also have the proliferation of different kinds of subcultures, where you've got like a big drug culture in certain places in Northern California, and we have a drug culture everywhere. But but in terms of people for whom their whole life revolves around drugs, you have sections of Northern California, parts of Colorado, and all of that, where the marijuana culture and all that stuff is the norm. So I think that's kind of what it would look like. It would kind of look like what I just outlined.
Keith, you stated that one critic of anarchism stated that anarchism is the most reactionary philosophy, and it views the critic viewed the state as a civilizer. Do you think the state is a civilizer, or is the state like the heir of the Enlightenment, so to speak, or and the state is an uncivilized entity that needs to be civilized? Why do you disagree with that critic who states that? I mean, if you ask the person on the street, if you got rid of the state, you'd have, although that might be changing, but if you ask the person on the street in the developed world, they wouldn't say that. They would say that the state is a civilized. That's sort of a common view, I would think. I didn't back this up with polling, but I would intuitively assume that's the primary view. Like, what would happen if you got rid of the state? You have anarchy in the streets. Do you think the state is a civilizer? And if not, why don't you think that way?
Well, I go back a lot further than the Enlightenment. I wouldn't say that the state is an error of the Enlightenment. I'd say it's more of an error of the ancient Mesopotamia, of the dawn of history. There's some very good work in the field of anthropology on this by a guy named James Scott, who is a professor of anthropology at, I think, Yale. And he's written quite a bit about the origins of the state, about how the state first started to appear in ancient Mesopotamia and the areas that are known as Egypt and Babylon and all of that, Sumeria. And the state, his theories of anthropology based on his anthropological research more or less validate what anarchists, libertarians, some radical classical liberals, even some socialists have always said about the origins of the state, and that is that the state ultimately arose through a process of plunder and conquest during the agricultural revolution. That the state emerged because some people were going out and conquering and enslaving and dispossessing other groups, and out of that you started to see the emergence of static societies with these kinds of class and political hierarchies, and then the emergence of state religions that created an aura of legitimacy for the state system. We start to see that kind of system evolving back in ancient Egypt, about 5,500 years ago, and Babylon, Sumeria, Arcadia, some other ancient civilizations. And that's more or less the system that we've inherited ever since. I mean, each new epoch or generation or era or whatever has more or less retained that system in some form, even if there have been changes along the way. We may not, have, human sacrifice to the sun god or whatever or we might not literally believe that the head of state is a divine being, but we still have the same kind of system of exploitive elites, a state system that has some kind of ideological superstructure that supposedly upholds the legitimacy of the state. So nothing much has really changed in 5,500 years. I mean, lots of little things have changed, but and some medium level things have changed, but the core concept of what the state is hasn't changed. The big question is if we could undo history and we could go back and say, well, what if the beginning of civilization had not been based on conquest, but had been based on, say, voluntary cooperation, voluntary exchange, free association, mutual aid, voluntary federation, all of these other ideas that anarchists are in favor of. What would have come about? Well, we would have had anarchism of some kind. So it's kind of like this idea of the state is what you get when you don't have the other things that I just described. And in that way, I think the state is comparable to something like crime. There's this thing. You could certainly argue that one of the things that I've heard apologists for the state say is that the state is inevitable, the state is natural. They tend to compare the state to something like the family. They think the state is like an extended family. They have these kinds of organic theories of the state. I've heard a lot of traditionalists who are, say, monarchists and thinkers like that make this kind of argument. And, liberal thinkers will make sort of a watered down version of the same argument where, the state is not a family, it's a social contract or something like that. But I don't really buy any of that. I mean, the state is basically what is basically the result of what would be considered crime in any other context. Now, of course, you could also argue that, well, crime is certainly a naturally occurring thing. There's every society that's ever existed has had crime on some level. And of course, crime is somewhat subjective. Things that are considered crime in some societies aren't considered crime in other societies. But most societies generally have norms where you're not supposed to go looting. You're not supposed to, burglarize somebody else's house. You're not supposed to kill somebody if you want their tennis shoes. Those kinds of things. Most societies have rules like that. But what becomes the state is really organized criminal activity on a large scale. Now, the question is, while that may be something that does occur naturally in nature, that doesn't mean that we should simply resign ourselves to it and say, well, whatever will be, because you could take that argument with natural disasters. You could say, well, hurricanes happen, so, why ever bother to build any flood walls or tornadoes happen, so, why bother with, tornado warning sirens or earthquakes happen, so, don't bother with any earthquake insurance, anything like that. And I think that's where a lot of the arguments for the state go wrong. They have this argument that, well, that's just seems to be the way it always is, or it just happens. So therefore, it must be a good thing. You could say that about disease. Well, there've always been diseases. People still get diseases. So, why bother to do any medical research or invent better drugs for diseases or better treatments or better surgical techniques? Why not just say, well, disease will happen and just let it be? I guess that's kind of, how I approach the anarchism from a more reflective or philosophical perspective.
If the state is a criminal organization, which the right libertarians like Hoppe and Socrates, for that matter, more or less agrees with, why hasn't it withered away? And one of the points that MacIntyre makes in his book is that that power co-ops absolutely. On the road to power, a lot of anarchists And I actually discussed this with Todd Lewis and Brenton Langle like three years ago as well, that on the road to power, they're very radical and pure. And in power, they're less radical and more co-opted and just sort of, and actually in some ways it's a virtue when they become sort of mild managerial bureaucracies. And that's another point that MacIntyre makes. So if you view the state as a criminal organization, why hasn't it gone away? I mean, you should have made a point that crime is in a way natural, and the state is just sort of the ultimate, form of criminal. So there's a good joke that says, what do you call a few thieves a gang? What do you call an organized band? A government. It's a common joke. There's other sort of jokes about which basically have the same rough punchline. It's just kind of crime. This becomes tricky because a lot of them will say, well, we want justice, but we want justice through the existing state. And actually, this showed up in the sort of Foucault-Chomsky debate where Foucault was saying that he's not doing it in the name of power, not in justice. He doesn't really view justice. And justice itself is sort of, but whose justice, so to speak, is called. So anarchism itself, this is one of the things I like about it. It's fairly pure. It's sort of an idea against unjust authority. But it seems like in some ways, 500 years ago, you had some authorities, but now they actually have arguably more control over our lives, in some ways, the mass surveillance state, for one thing. And this is why, for example, the Mennonites and Amish, they probably have less, in certain groups in like Peru, or certain groups in certain uncut groups might have more, air quote, freedom by not being, bought into the sort of system of banking and surveillance and internet and so forth, which is a kind of weird tendency. So maybe 500 years ago, people had more freedom. So the state arguably state power has grown, although in some ways freedom has grown too. Of course, all this is dependent on definitions of words. But I don't think we can sort of get too much bogged in. I think words have some kind of agreed upon meaning in itself. So why hasn't the state withered away? And more precisely, a lot of, if I understand correctly, historically Marxists and anarchists generally, well, at least left anarchists and Marxists generally agreed at least on goals. But as I stated early on, the projects just sort of turned into some version of welfare state capitalism of some version. And they had their merits and demerits. But nonetheless, there seem to be more of the same. Would you agree with that question? And why hasn't it withered away if it's so common? Keith?
Yeah, well, older forms of the state have withered away. We don't really find the kind of state systems that we found in antiquity as much anymore. In fact, I would argue that the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century were basically an effort to resurrect the kind of systems you saw in antiquity, where instead of worshiping the emperor as a godlike being, they're simply given godlike qualities, like the Führer principle or the dear leader or something like that. I mean, the way that Kim Jong-un is revered and elevated as this kind of quasi-divine figure in North Korea. I mean, that's what a lot of ancient states were like. So that's nothing new from a historical perspective. So that kind of thinking isn't quite as common, or to the degree that it is, it's watered down a bit. We don't really have a lot of the features that we saw, say, of medieval feudal systems. We don't, in most modern countries, we don't burn people at the stake for witchcraft or heresy. We don't literally have chattel slaves. We don't have indentured servitude. Well, I guess you could say we do in some ways. We could say the prison system is a form of slavery, or the student loan debt is a form of indentured servitude, or something like that. But it's still watered down by the historical norm. So there are different manifestations of the state have withered away, but the state itself has never really withered away. Instead it's been reinvented in different forms, where you still have an exploitive elite or ruling class and an institution that has a monopoly on coercion in the form of modern states, and has an ideological superstructure of its own. As to why it's never withered away, I mean, one reason I think is that it's never really been called into question on the level that would be necessary for the state to wither away. If we look at a lot of ideas and beliefs that people had in past times, there are certainly a lot of things people believed in past times that aren't that common. One was slavery. Aristotle defended slavery. He thought it was a natural condition, that there were just some people that was just their natural spot in life. Just like we today might think, well, there are some people who are just destined to be, mediocre or sub-mediocre because they're just not very bright or, whatever. Aristotle thought slavery was a natural condition. In fact, I think even John Locke, who was one of the early liberals, I think even he was not, if I remember correctly, wasn't opposed to slavery per se. And yet very few people actually believe in slavery today. I mean, maybe in certain parts of the world or a handful of countries they still do, but that's certainly not the norm. We don't really, in most of the developed countries, we don't really believe in say, religious persecution for, witchcraft or apostasy or blasphemy or something like that. And the reason why is that most people just aren't that religious or don't really take religion that seriously. Or if they do, it's watered down or assumed a new form or something like that. And you can argue it's also been replaced by ideology, that ideology has become the new religion, where, nowadays, you're not going to be, fired from your job, say, if you deny one of the 39 articles, but you will if you deny some, principle of social justice or something like that. There's been other variations of that as well. I know at one point in the United States, in some of the school systems, back during the Cold War, early Cold War period, to graduate from high school, you had to swear a loyalty oath to the United States or something like that. But I think that the big picture-wise, the problem is that people just haven't come to question the legitimacy of the state in the same way that they may question the other things. A good example is that right now, certainly in the United States and in a number of other countries, people talk a lot about racism, and racism now has become something that's a taboo and discouraged, and somebody who is perceived as racist is somebody that's perceived as being morally suspect or whatever. But nobody really thinks that about the state. I mean, imagine if you had a cultural ethos where being called a statist was as bad as being called a racist or being called a Nazi or being called a pedophile or something like that. Right. Well, it's certainly possible to envision the possibility of a society like that, where if you get called a statist, it's like being called racist today or being called pedophile, or maybe like being called a communist in the 1950s America or something like that, or being called a blasphemer in the Islamic world or whatever. But that's, but I think that the level of, thought and consciousness or awareness or whatever just really hasn't evolved to that level, at least on this issue. People, for whatever reason, still accept the legitimacy of the state on some level. Although I do think it's interesting to see how even that has changed quite a bit in terms of what kinds of states are considered legitimate. If you were to round up a whole lot of people, certainly in the developed countries, North America and Europe and all of that, and ask them, what does it mean to have a legitimate form of government? Is an absolute monarchy where the king has absolute power, is that a legitimate form of government? A lot of people would probably say no. Is a military dictatorship legitimate? They'd probably say no. Depending on who you asked, if you said is communism legitimate, they might say no. Probably most would say fascism is not a legitimate form of government, or hereditary aristocracy, or a literal religious theocracy like they have in Saudi Arabia. So it is true that all of these different kinds of models of the state have to a large degree been discredited or at least delegitimized in terms of popular opinion over time. But you have these new ideological frameworks that are used to legitimize modern states, like this belief in mass democracy or the social contract or the general will, or all of the various liberal theories of the state. Those are really the idea of the divine right of kings as applies to modern states. So I think if that were to fade, I think that's really That would be interesting, because then how would the state go and legitimize itself at that point?
So if it was the case that holding statist views was held in the same esteem as being a Nazi or a paedophile, for example, would you then expect on that basis anarchism to flourish? And if it were to do so, how might the state reemerge, or do you think it would reemerge at some point? What kind of conditions would need to be in place for its preservation, or its eventual or of the eventual sort of reemergence of the state?
Well, in a cultural environment where being called statist was as bad as being called a pedophile or something, we have something of a test market for that, and that's internet discussion forums. You can go to anarchist or libertarian discussion forums and see all the different types of anarchists and libertarians arguing over who is most statist or who is most fascist or who is most something or other, and as well as you see a lot of arguments about what kind of cultural framework is most compatible with libertarianism or anarchism. That seems to be the big thing among a lot of American libertarians now. There's this huge back and forth over should libertarians be cultural conservatives, or should they be cultural leftists, or something else. And I think that, in a world where being a statist is like being a Nazi or being a child molester or something like that, you'd still see all of these other arguments. You'd always, you would see people with different beliefs about all kinds of things accusing each other of being statist. Like, well, if you're not a vegetarian, you're eating meat, you're a statist. You're a state that's imposing your authoritarian will on animals, or about children's rights. Well, if you don't believe children should be able to, run away from home at will and, be shoeshine boys or something like that, well, then you're being a statist. I would see those kinds of arguments perhaps taking place. As far as how the state could reemerge, I think in crisis situations, you would have people trying to exploit crisis situations to gain power and say, well, this anarchy thing didn't work, we need to go back to the state. Or you'd have people inventing new types of states, but not really calling it states. You saw that in the Spanish Civil War, where you had the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War that, for as far as I can tell, more or less created states of their own, but then claimed they weren't states, they were anarchies. They're not states because of the special way in which they're organized or something like that. So I think you might see issues of that type as well. Of course, the left libertarian crowd, one thing that and the left anarchists, socialist anarchists too, they talk a lot about, well, the state is not the only form of oppression. The state's not the only form of authoritarianism. To some degree, I think that's true, in the sense that it's possible to, and certainly there has been things like, say, tribal federations that weren't necessarily states in a conventional sense, certainly not in the way modern people would think of them, or even weren't states compared to ancient forms of the state. But there was still violence, there was still, wife beating or child abuse or, cruelty to animals or something that somebody somewhere would, disapprove of. Of course, you could argue, well, that gets over into separate issues. That's not really about the state. That's just about, human nature and what humans are capable of and what humans will or won't do in any circumstances. So yeah, I mean, the gist of it is, I think you'd still have, in a world where the state is as taboo as, say, pedophilia is today, you'd have people, accusing each other of statism, for not sharing whatever, value system they have about other things. And you'd also have people trying to bring back the state in some particular form, by appealing to whatever. And then you would have people trying to reinvent the state in some new form, by claiming it's not a state, it's something else. I mean, they do that now. I mean, if you look at all the different anarchist and libertarian factions that you can find all over the place, and social media groups and stuff, that's what they do now.
You basically describe anarchism. You could describe it anarchism in name only. I mean, that's one. This is always the classic true Scotsman type idea that the Spanish anarchists had they're anarchies are not states. The state will reemerge as this. Do you think you think this is going to be stuck in this sort of pattern, so to speak, of rhinos or communists in name only? This tendency seems to be it keeps coming back, and a lot of the left anarchists keep being quickly co-opted by the state. So like if you don't, the state will gladly, and that's one of the reasons to be suspicious of like BLM, for example. It's just a reason to go out and create a federal police force, which I think in our earlier police episode you said putting the mouse in charge of the cheese, I think was your term you used to describe it. There's a lot of tendencies that if you think wife beating is worse than the state, the state will gladly go after husbands. There's all these sorts of tendencies get exploited. So the state is in a kind of privileged position where all it takes is one tendency. Or for the right, for example, they'll say, well, abortion or pornography or something like that. Well, now the right's advocating stuff like that too. So there's all these tendencies. So broadly speaking, you think the state is in some ways inevitable or highly likely, at least a state in some kind of form. Keith, this will be our final question here. Very interesting discussion.
Well, I'll say this. This is an analogy I like to use. I've mentioned this in other programs like this that I've done. I don't think you're a program, but maybe others. One of the things that I used to do or have done with students is when I'm teaching social science classes is I'll show them a series of videos on all the different types of philosophies. Well, not all of them, but all the major political philosophies. Like I'll show a series of about 10 or so short videos explaining what a modern liberal is, what a classical liberal is, what a conservative is, what a communist is, what a socialist is, what an anarchist is, what a modern libertarian is, what a fascist is. And then they would have to write a paper explaining which one they agree with the most and why. And I think that if we had a world where most people picked the anarchist position, where say anarchism was the world's most popular political philosophy, I think we have some test markets for that as well. One is in the area of religion. Historically and in the world today, Christianity is the world's most popular religion. In the sense of the number of adherents and geographical areas where it's dominant and all of that. But if we look at Christianity, it's subdivided into it's subdivided into a number of major traditions, and then many more minor traditions, and then many more sectarian traditions, as well as splinter groups and heresies and heterodoxies and apostasies. I mean, you could even argue that something like the Church of Scientology or the Church of Satan or even these atheist Sunday morning assemblies, even those are spinoffs of Christianity, because people wouldn't see the need to gather on Sunday morning and talk about religion if it weren't for the influence of Christianity, or they wouldn't be calling themselves a church, even if it's the Church of Satan, if it wasn't for the influence of Christianity, because it's Christianity who called their places of worship a church. If you look at all the different types of Christianity, you see that there are groups that, first of all, don't recognize each other as being legitimate. You see groups that aren't even recognizable when you compare them with each other. If you compare the high church Anglicans or the Episcopalians, as we call them in the States, if we compare them with, say, the lowbrow, low church snake handlers and people like that, or if we compare, say, the civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, who were Christian ministers, with something like Christian identity, which is like a racist, kind of Aryanist Christianity, like Christian Nazis or something, or if you compare, say, the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a gay church, with, say, something like Fred Phelps, Christianity is pretty broad. And I think anarchism, as the world's most popular political philosophy, would be very similar. You would have multiple major traditions, multiple minor, many more minor traditions, many subdivisions, sectarian groups, cults, splinters, heresies, heterodoxies, apostasies, and so forth. And just like Christianity also has to share space with other religions like Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and all that, an intellectually, a culturally hegemonic anarchism would still have to share space with other philosophies that hadn't, died out entirely either. And then you'd get intermediary positions, you'd get like hybrid philosophies of different types. And then that's, on a more intellectual or cultural level, that's what anarchism would look like in a hegemonic sense. And then there's the big question, well, what kind of institutions would anarchism produce? And then that all gets down to, well, what are the prerequisites for being an anarchist in the first place? Is it about abolishing the state? Is it about voluntarism on a general level? Is it about non-hierarchy? Is it about individualism? Is it about decentralism? Is it about mutual aid and voluntary cooperation? Is it about being, gay accepting or whatever? If you get a group of people who claim to be anarchists together and ask them what the criteria for being an anarchist are, it's going to be about like getting a bunch of Christians together and asking them what the criteria for being a Christian is. It's going to vary a lot compared, depending on their area of emphasis or whatever tradition they come from. But how do Christians deal with this? Well, you have Christianity that's fragmented into all these different kinds of church denominations, ranging from large mega churches all the way down to people that are having church in their basement or somewhere in their garage. And I think anarchists, communities and sectarian groups would be the same way. You might have some large anarchist organizations and federations, and then you might have others, like some group of people living in a mountain in a shack somewhere saying, well, we're the anarchist tribe of whatever, our tribe of six or whatever we are. And if you look at religious institutions, most Christian countries have separation of church and state. Even if they don't have formal separation of church and state, they might as well, because church attendance or participation isn't really compulsory in any serious way. Like I know over in England, I think you guys still have we do have the Church of England, but I've read that only like 5% of people in England go to church or something like that. So in America, it's a lot more, even though we don't really have a state church. But if you have things like, say, the Vatican, you have the Vatican, which is technically a very centralized, hierarchical institution. Certainly the Catholic Church is, but then its headquarters is this tiny little micronation, Vatican City. And other than that, on a worldwide basis, it's largely a voluntary international federation. So it's almost kind of anarchistic in the sense that participation is largely voluntary, although internally it's also very hierarchical. And then you have something like the World Council of Churches, which is a collection of Protestant denominations that are, relatively ecumenical about a lot of things, but then it's a large international group, but it's also voluntary. So I think anarchism politically would be sort of a political version of that, in the sense you'd have all kinds of anarchistic communities and federations and associations and clubs and activities that would largely be voluntary, or at least decentralized enough that people could not participate in them if they don't really want to. On that, the exit costs are low enough to make them at least quasi-voluntary. And then even though you might have some projects that were large and even transnational or international or even global, it wouldn't be something that most people couldn't avoid if they really wanted to. And so I think that's kind of what anarchism in a hegemonic sense would look like, more or less. So we have some interesting test markets for that, I guess. The same thing would be true of anarchist economics. There's this big debate about what would anarchist economics look like. I think that one interesting model to look at is food production or food services. In the Soviet system, where you had a very centralized system of food production and distribution, you didn't even have supermarkets or restaurants or anything like that. You just had what they call food store number 1 or food store number 2, or you might have had cafes and things like that. I think in the latter years they started having more things like that. But in the United States, if you look at food service, we've got everything from corner convenience stores to big supermarket chains to restaurants, serving every possible taste. Some places sell nothing but health food. Some places sell nothing but junk food. So I think economic arrangements in an anarchistic economy would be similar as well.
Thank you for your time, Keith. That's been interesting as always. And now I'd like to thank everybody for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share and subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com.